When building a deck for Lorcana, you can use cards from up to 2 ink colors, and there are 6 ink colors to choose from: Amber, Amethyst, Emerald, Ruby, Sapphire, and Steel. Now that the entirety of the first chapter has been revealed, let's take a deep dive into the strengths and weaknesses of each color and take a look at what archetypes each color pair seems to be pushing. First up is Amber, which, as I've said previously, is a character-focused color. This is so far the only color able to retrieve character cards from your discard pile, and also has ways to get those characters out of your deck and into play sooner. The big payload cards of Amber care about what other characters you play, with Hades King of Olympus giving you an extra lore for each villain you have in play, and Stitch Rockstar drawing you a card whenever you play a cheap character. Speaking of draw, Amber has some powerful conditional draw tools. Aside from Rockstar, there's also Carefree Surfer, who again cares about how many characters you have in play, and Rapunzel gifted with healing, touching on another major theme to Amber: healing, which is one way to keep your characters around for longer. Retrieving banished or discarded characters is also a source of card advantage. Finally, there is a secondary focus on songs and singing them, with Amber having the most songs of any color, as well as the only color to use the keyword singer, letting them play songs earlier than other colors. Ariel Spectacular Singer pairs us with yet another instance of conditional card draw. If singing songs and making sure your characters stay alive sounds appealing to you, take a look at Amber. However, Amber struggles to deal with opposing boards being limited to trying to find favorable challenges or proactively discarding threats with "You Have Forgotten Me." Instead, Amber usually wants to be questing and forcing their opponent to challenge into them through lore pressure and high-value characters. Amethyst is the color of unconditional card advantage. There are multiple cards that just draw one or more cards for you without you needing to jump through hoops first. Friends on the Other Side and Maleficent Sorceress are some of the best cards in the game for this reason. To pair with all that draw, Amethyst has several tools to peek at the top of your deck and rearrange things, ensuring you draw what you want when you want. Amethyst also gets card advantage from putting characters back into hand if they're banished in a challenge, letting them be reused almost indefinitely. While it doesn't have any explicit mechanical theming around characters like Amber, Amethyst does have the largest selection of them, and is able to use Rush and Challenger to take out opposing characters, though it lacks any actions or abilities that straight up remove characters. To help give their challengers targets, Amethyst has multiple ways to exert opposing characters so they can be dealt with. Pick Amethyst if you want to control the board and maintain a full hand. However, Amethyst lacks any true late-game threats, relying on constantly refilling their hand rather than top-decking singular bomb cards. Where Amethyst wants to challenge, Emerald wants to be challenged. As the trickiest of colors, both to play as and play against, this is a color that warrants planning ahead. There are several cards that hurt your opponent when they're challenged, and Emerald is the only color able to make opposing characters reckless, forcing them to take the challenges you present. Besides reckless, Emerald has a few other ways to prevent opponents from questing, such as with Jasper Common Crook and Mother Gothel's Selfish Manipulator. Emerald has the most ink-efficient removal tools, as they are either dependent on a character being challenged into and banished, or only return a character to their player's hand rather than banishing them. This encourages an aggressive playstyle, scrambling for as much lore as you can before your opponent can really deal with you. This is aided by having the cheapest characters with 3 lore pips of all the colors. Pick Emerald if you want to aggressively quest and give your opponents unfavorable challenges. However, Emerald lacks any reliable card draw, and if your opponent is able to power through your bounces and discards, the color has little to offer at high ink cost. Ruby is another challenging color, with a couple characters giving you a perk if you challenge and banish an opposing character, and having multiple ways to ready exerted characters to challenge again. Ruby also has several ways to reduce your opponent's lore total, letting you come back against an early aggressive quester. This is also the color of unconditional removal, with the only cards that straight up banish a character, most notably Dragonfire and Be Prepared. Ruby also has multiple characters that are naturally reckless in exchange for having increased stats, letting them challenge potentially multiple times. Ruby is the color of big plays and big swings, and with the most expensive cards in the game, tends to dominate the board with a single card. However, Ruby characters tend to have lower stats for their cost than other colors, and having so many expensive cards means they can struggle in the early game, though their lore stealing and bombs can help them come back from a seemingly losing position. The primary focus of Sapphire is ramp, getting more cards into your inkwell than normal. Multiple cards either let you ink more than once per turn, or put cards from elsewhere into your inkwell. This is also Sapphire's main removal, turning opposing characters into enemy ink with Let It Go and Hades' Infernal Schemer. While this can help an opponent play new cards, it does prevent Amber from getting cards back from the discard pile. Once you've reached a massive inkwell, Sapphire also has several cards that reward doing so, most notably Belle Strange But Special, who has the highest static lore in the game once you reach 10 ink. The secondary theme of Sapphire is items, with multiple cards either reducing the cost to play items or rewarding you for playing items. Pick Sapphire if you want to play lots of expensive cards and quickly. However, Sapphire has limited draw options and very little to do in the early game other than fill their inkwell. The final color, Steel, is another challenge-focused color. They have multiple cards with Challenger and cards that reward you for banishing opposing characters in a challenge. It is also the color of direct damage, having the most ink-efficient removal in the game, allowing them to dominate the board in the early game and effectively deal with wide boards of small characters, particularly with Grab Your Sword. Steel also has a surprising amount of draw, though usually attached to discarding cards from your hand or otherwise encouraging you to have an empty hand. Pick Steel if you want to have unmatched early board control or want to quickly run through your deck to get specific cards. However, Steel struggles to deal with high willpower characters, has limited late game options, and generally lags behind in lore production compared to the other colors. Now let's talk about color pairings. As we've seen, each color has things they do well and things they struggle with. Ideally, you want to pair two colors that make up for each other's weaknesses, but you can make any color pair work, as long as you're aware of what you can and can't do with it. Amber Amethyst decks tend to focus on swarming out lots of cheap characters. These are the colors with the most one-drops, particularly Lilo Making a Wish and Maleficent Biding Her Time, the only one-drops that quest for 2 lore. They also have very good 2-drops, notably Simba Protective Cub being the cheapest bodyguard in the game, allowing you to protect those high-value yet highly vulnerable 1-drops. This color pair usually wants to peak at 4 ink, either throwing out Mickey Mouse Wayward Sorcerer to get infinite brooms, or shifting Rockstar to make a massive board. Amethyst also provides the draw to let you empty and refill your hand multiple times. However, these decks are particularly vulnerable to Steel's cheap removal. Amber Emerald has a bit of a villain's theme, having the most available to reward a King of Olympus focused deck, and is also the color pair of forced discard. However, decks with these colors tend to try to cheat out Emerald's high lore characters with Amber's Lantern and Just in Time. These more expensive cards are a bit more resilient than the 1 and 2 drops of Amber Amethyst, but these decks lack Amethyst's card draw to refill their hand, relying largely on Rapunzel gifted with healing. Ruby gives Amber the one thing it lacks, good removal. This lets their pairing deal with large threats while still questing. Amber Ruby is also surprisingly a good choice for a princess deck, with Moana of Motunui able to let Mulan Imperial Soldier challenge multiple times per turn. Amber's healing also lets Mulan and Aladdin Heroic Outlaw keep challenging and survive longer than usual. Amber Sapphire is the color pair of strength manipulation, being the colors that get the support keyword as well as several cards that reduce opposing strength, allowing their characters to make very advantageous challenges. These are also the 2 colors with healing, making these decks particularly resilient. Amber and Steel are the bodyguard colors, with multiple cards available to protect your high lore threats. Surprisingly, this pairing is also great for song synergy, with Steel's high impact yet high cost songs going very well with Amber's singers, particularly Ariel. Amber Steel is probably the most viable choice for making an Ursula's Shell Necklace deck work. Stitch Rockstar also does well in these colors, as Steel, similar to Amethyst, has good cheap characters and decent draw. Amethyst Emerald mixes aggro with control, able to get out high lore characters on curve while also being able to rely on either Amethyst's challengers or Emerald's bounce tools to deal with opposing characters. While not as aggressive lore-wise as Amber Amethyst, Emerald can dissuade challenges with its many characters that hurt the opponent when attacked. Emerald's ward characters can also guarantee lore, being immune to chosen removal. Amethyst and Ruby are the rush colors. Their characters come out swinging, and with Amethyst's ability to exert ready characters, no one is safe. Amethyst's draw also lets it keep inking longer than normal, letting this pairing access the higher cost ruby bombs that other color duos often can't justify running. Amethyst Sapphire wants to draw and ramp, then drop high lore, high willpower characters. Elsa Spirit of Winter and Ursula Power Hungry are usually too expensive to include in other decks, but Sapphire's ink increasers let them come out early. Alongside Sapphire's big characters, this deck can be difficult to deal with without access to Ruby's removal. Amethyst Steel is a premier control deck, able to remove anything played in the first few turns, then refill your hand while your opponent's is empty. This color pairing may lag somewhat in lore production, but that doesn't really matter if your opponent doesn't have any characters out to contest you. However, this deck tends to struggle against higher willpower characters that Steel's damage can't effectively deal with. Emerald and Ruby are the evasive colors, and Emerald's high lore output paired with Ruby's removal is a frightening prospect for anyone to face, particularly when their characters can't be challenged. Amethyst does also have some evasive characters, but Emerald Ruby is able to get them out reliably on curve. However, evasive characters naturally have lower willpower for their cost, and this deck is vulnerable to Steel's direct damage. Emerald and Sapphire have the highest lore output in the game, with multiple 3 lore characters and the ability to ramp into large threats. Emerald's ink-efficient bouncing and forced discard can help keep your opponent at bay, while your Sapphire cards ramp you to your key characters. Emerald Steel is a peculiar kind of control deck, with Steel able to banish small characters with damage, and Emerald able to bounce higher willpower threats, putting the problem off for later, or more hilariously, forcing your opponent to discard it, particularly with a whole new world. Emerald also gives Steel the high lore characters it really wants, and thus good reason to run bodyguards. Ruby Sapphire is the premier ramp deck, with Ruby having the best expensive cards in the game, making it a natural companion to Sapphire. This pairing wants to spend the first few turns just ramping, as allowing your opponent to build a board means nothing if you're throwing down Be Prepared on turn 5. These colors have the hardest removal in the game and the best bombs, making Ruby Sapphire very difficult to deal with. Its one weakness is a lack of good draw, so an Amethyst deck might be able to outpace it. Pairing Ruby's late game removal with Steel's early game removal means these colors never let your opponent have anything on the board. These are also the colors that reward challenging and banishing characters, letting you thoroughly back your opponent into a corner. Ruby Steel decks are slower to accumulate lore, but that doesn't matter much if your opponent has no characters. Sapphire Steel can be played as a standard ramp control deck similar to Ruby Sapphire, but these colors are probably the most viable choice for an item-focused deck, being the colors with the most items, and Beast's Mirror in particular helping keep your drawing and inking going well past other colors. Even Lowly Frying Pan can be useful, being another cheap trigger for Maurice and able to be retrieved by Tamatoa So Shiny. Now, which color pairing will you go for? Get in the comments with your favorite duo, or if you have a cool deck idea for a color pair I haven't thought of.